As we've mentioned, the Yellow Vest protests are having an impact beyond France's borders and may have broader implications for Europe. For more on that, we've reached Techau. He's Senior Fellow and Director of Europe Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He spoke to us from Berlin. You have written that Europe is now just returning to its normal nastiness. Now, I know you were writing about Brexit in that instance, but given what we've seen with the Gilets Jaunes and the deterioration of relations between France and Italy, what further impact do you think the Gilets Jaunes might have in Europe?
I think they are a reminder that the populist backlash against globalization, against removing borders and all of this is not a privilege of the far right. And it's also something that you see with people, who are further on the left, who have primarily economic motivations and not so much identity politics motivations. That disgruntlement is basically a phenomenon across the full spectrum of politics here. And that, of course, has a huge impact on the debate in Europe, because so far in the last couple of years, we've kind of gotten used to the idea that populism must necessarily come from the right. But I think the Gilets Jaunes and the disgruntled people from the provincial parts of our countries who feel like the urban elites do not care much about them, they also have a voice now. And it has in France had a specific impact, as you have heard from Mr. Moisy, on that coalition that brought Macron to power. And it's going to play out differently in other countries, but it is a force to reckon with.
You're speaking to us from Berlin, and historically France and Germany have been strong friends and allies over the course of this, and that was reinforced recently between Macron and Merkel. How are these protests viewed in Germany?
It depends a little bit on who you ask. Some people say that this is a sign of things to come in Germany. Germany is in a different situation than France in that it has had basically 10 years of growth, 10 years of economic boom, not really too much of economic hardship playing out in society very much. Unlike in France, where growth has been lackluster and unemployment is fairly high. So Germany is kind of insulated and cushioned a little bit still from the impact of that kind of criticism and fundamental systematic criticism. But as the economy is slowing here, and as lots of people actually feel that despite the fact that Germany's economy is strong, the future might not be as bright as the present, there's a potential for this kind of protest here as well. It might only really come to fruition over the next few years. But as we always know, these kinds of things need a little bit of time to really impact fully. And so a lot of people over here are bracing themselves also for debates of this kind.
If you look ahead now to the European elections that are coming this spring, some members of the Gilets Jaunes have said that they are going to participate in those elections. What kind of impact might that have more broadly across Europe as people see that kind of political engagement, I'll call it?
I think, at the most fundamental level, it seems to me that this is going to take away even further votes from the classic, center-left, center-right politics, the middle-of-the-road politics that for so long dominated our political landscape over here. Already, consensus or, the large parts of that old coalition in the middle somehow, the boring parts of the political spectrum, large parts of those have already migrated to the fringes. And if you have yet another force out there that comes up with a much more fundamental criticism of the system, then that will take even more away from that central, already kind of emptied out and hollowed out center of the political system. So I think that's the most general thing I can say. How this then plays out in practical terms in the individual party systems of all of those different countries is another story. But I think what we see here is a further erosion of the center. And that cannot really, make anybody interested in fairly moderate politics very happy.
I got to say, what does that portend? But I mean, you've pointed out that the boredom may be gone, the stability may be gone. What does that suggest about what you're looking at down the road in Europe?
I mean, it's very hard to make these kind of, sweeping statements about where politics in Europe is and how it is developing. As we can already see, we have striking divisions between how things play out in Southern Europe as opposed to the North, in Eastern Europe as opposed to some parts of the West. And so, to make a sweeping statement is probably difficult in this case. But as I said, the center will be more hollowed out, and I think politicians will be hard-pressed, to embrace some of these more radical, recipes, which is something that Europeans fundamentally are not used to. There has not really been very fundamental criticism of the way we operate things here. And the problem is that this kind of that the identity politics criticism of the right, the more fundamental economic criticism from the left, comes at the very moment that this system in Europe is also under stress from the outside, with the United States that is less interested in being the arbiter of last resort, with Russia playing up and China also aspiring to buy into this market. So you add another stress factor to a system that is already under stress, and how the current set of elites is going to deal with this is very much the question over here.
Not that long ago, Macron was hailed as the new leader of Europe, sort of following in the footsteps of Angela Merkel. How compromised do you think that is now?
I think Macron's stature even as almost like the redeemer in European politics, as he was seen by many, because he defeated the far right, he sent out a very pro-European message. That standing has already been, has already diminished to a large extent, not only because he finds it so difficult to actually reform France, which is really the kind of most important litmus test he needs to face, but also because his diplomacy in Europe, appears to really be a lot clumsier than people thought. He and Italy have gone into a huge kind of dispute of the kind we haven't seen in generations. Just today, we've seen a huge case of flip-flopping on a very important diplomatic case, a pipeline project which Germany put under pressure, where initially France, criticized Germany, but then caved in, thereby alienating a number of people in Eastern Europe. So we've seen a president who doesn't seem to be quite sure as to where he wants to go, and that he is on top of his game. Given the scarcity of good leadership, in Europe at the moment, to see this president who came in as a very fresh force, to see him diminish diplomatically is bad news, not just for France, but also for all the rest of us.
What are you watching for now as we head into the period that leads up to these parliamentary elections?
I think I'm watching two things, perhaps. The one thing is whether the unified right in Europe is actually unified, whether there is such a thing as a movement on the right that can coordinate messages and then turn that into a huge number of votes in the European Parliament elections in May. I think that's the one key thing. We all expect some sort of landslide on the right, but how big is it actually going to be? And this will tell us a lot whether these right-wing movements are, basically nationalist movements, or whether they can transcend this and go into pan-European mode. That's the number one thing. And the second thing, of course, is the economic development. We are currently in a bit of a European economic downswing, not a massive one yet, but one that also affects the economic powerhouse of Europe, which is Germany. The numbers do not look so great. In 2020, a recession is anticipated in the United States. And if we see over the next year or so, before the elections, but also then going into the post-election period, a significant downswing, then that is an additional stress factor to the ones that I've already named and mentioned. And then the political atmosphere in Europe will get, quite tense.
I thank you very much for your insight on this, and I hope that as those elections come closer, we'll have the chance to speak again.
Please let me know. Thank you very much.